The couple charged with human trafficking and forced labor after adopted children were found locked in a shed in Sissonville is set to go to trial on Monday. But this morning, attorneys hashed out some of the pretrial details, and in the process, we learned some more about this case, as Anna Saunders has that story for us tonight. But we do want to warn you before we show you the story that some of the images that you will see are disturbing.
Jeannie Whitefeather and Donald Lantz walked into their last hearing ahead of their Monday trial to go over some of the concerns about what evidence and what testimony will be allowed to go before a jury next week. One of those matters is about an investigation into alleged abuse involving Whitefeather and Lantz's treatment of their 5 adopted children before they moved to Sissonville in 2023. According to adoption records, Whitefeather and Lantz adopted 5 black siblings from Minnesota in 2018 and moved to Washington State in 2019. It has been the argument from Kanawha County prosecutors that the two targeted the children because of their race to use them for forced labor. And according to recent court filings from prosecutors, including pictures from Whitefeather's phone and videos from the surveillance cameras they kept on the children, the alleged abuse started in Washington and was even investigated by the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office and their Department of Children, Youth, and Families for a year before they moved to Kanawha County. According to the filing, they kept them on a large ranch in Washington, denying them bedrooms in the home and forcing them to work outside, where punishments included physical violence or the withholding of food. In 2 instances where 2 of the children tried to run away, the children told investigators Whitefeather would fire her gun at them.
And Mr. Lantz's alleged act of striking the child with a PVC pipe, we know about that only because there's a picture of it on Miss Whitefeather's cell phone, taken from their surveillance cameras, that they used in furtherance of all of their other acts to isolate and control the children.
In April of 2023, the two moved to Sissonville with the children, where court records say immediately after their arrival, neighbors began making reports to CPS about the children being forced to work on the property, stand for long periods of time, and use a porta potty in the yard. And then ultimately the report of children locked in a barn, which led deputies to the Sissonville home in October 2023, where Lantz and Whitefeather were arrested and later handed a 20-count indictment, including human trafficking, child abuse, and using a minor for forced labor.
They think that conduct in Washington during that 6 or 7 years is intrinsic to their case. I agree with them. On the other side of that is my client's conduct and response to that is highly relevant and highly probative.
In response, Whitefeather's attorney Mark Plants is hoping to paint a different picture with text messages, medical records, and witnesses at trial that the couple is not racist and did not target or abuse these children. This afternoon, we heard from the people who really set this whole case in motion. The neighbors there on Cheyenne Lane in Sissonville, who repeatedly called for wellness checks and calls for CPS checks as well. Now, we learned that those calls and concerns started almost immediately after Whitefeather and Lantz moved with their 5 adopted children from Washington State to Sissonville. 3 neighbors and 2 community members often in the area took the stand today and recalled that as soon as they moved in, they began noticing that the kids were working outside, doing things like mowing, carrying buckets of water and propane tanks, work that felt inappropriate for their ages. They said they never saw them play, only working or standing in a line with heads down near a porta potty only the children would use, and that they were seen for multiple days in the same clothes. By May 6, 2023, one neighbor testified she had already called for a wellness check from CPS on them because she left multiple times throughout that day and only saw them standing in that line. Her husband later testified that he confronted Lantz about his concerns.
I said, why are they standing in a line? Why do the kids not play?
And he said, they play all the time. And I said, no, they do not. I said, they haven't played since they moved in here.
And the last thing I told him was I was watching him.
How did he?
He told me he was watching me as well.
This morning, we heard from both the prosecution and the defense kind of laying out what this will look like from both angles. The prosecution really pushing that it all falls on the parents, that they were the ones who allegedly targeted these children and then used them for that forced labor. The defense attorney, Mark Plants, who's representing Whitefeather, he's taking a different approach, saying that it's the parents who were overwhelmed and seeking help for traumatized children. Anthony.
Anna, who else is expected to speak during this trial this week there?
So after we finish the neighbor testimony today, we are expected to hear tomorrow from police, see more of the surveillance camera footage that Whitefeather-Lantz kept on the property. And then later Thursday and Friday this week, we are expected to hear from the children victims in this case. 3 of them will be taking the stand. And we have been told already that the ruling from the judge is that we will not be allowed to film them. We will not be allowed to record them. But of course, we will bring you the latest. In that video, we saw 2 teens who were in the shed, and then we saw 2 children inside a room in the home, and they were being made forced to stand, forced to eat peanut butter sandwiches, and without being able to sleep in a bed, they were forced to sleep on the floor. Now, we've learned in trial that Whitefeather-Lantz kept 1 security camera in the shed with the 2 teens and kept the other one in an upstairs room. This is where a 9-year-old and 11-year-old stayed with no furniture, with just a tarp. The video is giving us a glimpse of their daily routine during this time period that started with them waking up at 4:30 in the morning after sleeping on the floor. In the shed, the 2 teens would hold up a sheet for each other while the other used the camper toilet. The rest of their days spent mostly in those rooms standing. At one point, when one of the teens sits down, Whitefeather then comes over the intercom on the camera, and she stands back up. You also hear the younger kids ask for permission to leave the room, to use the bathroom, and brush their teeth. We've learned that the 14-year-old boy in the shed has several mental health disorders, as Detective Anna Pyle with the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office testified that the 16-year-old girl in there with him served as his babysitter. This is her on the stand describing their sleeping conditions.
That the children in both rooms slept on the floor. The 2 in the barn area slept on the concrete floor, with sleeping on a sleeping bag on the concrete floor, and slept with nothing underneath him other than a piece of cardboard under his head.
And you can find more details from today's testimony over on our website. Just click on this story of a full rundown from each witness that took the stand, including all the details that we could not cover right here on.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us here at 6 o'clock. Tonight, for the first time in trial, a Kanawha County jury heard from one of the adopted teens who was discovered in a shed in Sissonville. This all as Jeannie Whitefeather and Donald Lantz remain on trial for charges including child abuse, human trafficking, and forced labor. Our Anna Saunders has been covering this all week for us and joins us live right now with a recap of today's emotional testimony. Anna?
Well, Anthony, it's hard to put to words just the gravity of what we witnessed in court today. You know, during this trial, we've heard so much about the 4 child victims. Really, we've heard a lot about them since they were discovered in October of 2023. Well, tonight, for the first time, we heard from one of them in the courtroom. It was the eldest child, who actually now is an adult, but was a 16-year-old girl at the time, as she faced Whitefeather-Lantz for the first time since she was separated from them. Now, as we've said, we are not allowed to film or record the victim, so you won't see or hear her. But in court this afternoon, she detailed both her life in Washington State and the move to Sissonville, where life with her 4 siblings, where she said life was bad in both places, and that included yard labor, sleeping outside, using the bathroom in a camper toilet, and being forced to stand all day while enduring physical and mental abuse, which she said included the use of a PVC pipe and pepper spray, and with the mental abuse including yelling and racial slurs. Now, once they made the move to Sissonville, she said at first they would be working outside and sometimes sleeping inside the house, but once neighbors started reporting them, they were moved inside and spent most of their time inside, forced to stand when they weren't sleeping. She did say a CPS worker came to visit them shortly after they moved, but they talked to her and her siblings through the screen door and did not tell her the truth about their experience because Lantz could hear them. Eventually, she said she and her 14-year-old brother, who had several mental health disorders, were locked in the shed. She was told by Whitefeather that she had to babysit her brother because he was, quote, psychotic. She said she was told that she was only allowed to yell at him and hit him, but not comfort him or touch him in any way. She said they mostly ate peanut butter sandwiches every day, and for 2 months leading up to their discovery, she and her brother did not shower and did not change clothes. At some points, they were allowed to leave the shed, but in the week and a half leading up to when they were found, she said she and her brother never left the shed. She detailed being forced to stand all day with hands on head. She said, quote, "We were always locked up somewhere." As of right now at lunch break, the state has rested, so we are expecting after lunch to start to hear from the defense attorneys. We are expecting later this afternoon to even hear from Whitefeather herself. Live here in Charleston, Anna Saunders, Eyewitness News. Jeannie Whitefeather took the stand this afternoon and contradicted all of it, painting a totally different picture of what life was like for the kids. Now, though we've heard testimony and seen video that said otherwise, Whitefeather took the stand and first said that the teens were never locked in the shed, that they knew about the key inside and could come and go as they pleased. She even referred to it as a teenage hangout. She said she used cameras on them to keep them safe. Whitefeather also said she never called the children racial names and that she cooked, cleaned, and washed clothes every day for the kids, despite 3 kids telling us they did the cleaning and clothes washing in plastic totes themselves and even went months without changing.
Anna Saunders is live outside the courthouse. Anna, you've done such a great job covering the details of this case. Talk to me. What did Lantz have to say, and were there any differences or really any similarities with what he testified compared to what Whitefeather testified in those days prior?
Well, Lantz came to the stand with a very similar message as Whitefeather, that they were 2 overwhelmed adoptive parents frustrated with their living situation, especially in Sissonville. He, too, denied all of the allegations. Now, he said the source of their frustration was mainly the 14-year-old boy.
And when, after the 100th time that your 10 to 13-year-old kid, who wets his pants, it gets a little bit frustrating because every time it takes time, you have to get him cleaned up, choose clothes, or his clothes used, and it gets frustrating.
Now, Lantz also talked about the forced labor allegations. He was asked if he made the kids do chores for hours at a time. He said not without a break, and that he always did the chores with them and that they were good for the kids to teach them responsibility. He also said the kids got allowances. Now, the defense is still presenting its case. Lantz is still on the stand. He still has to go through cross-examination from the prosecutor, so we are expecting to start back up again tomorrow morning. Human trafficking has been charged at the state circuit court level. This is usually something that's taken up in federal court. So, of course, with these unique charges and this unique circumstance, jury instructions took up the whole afternoon as both sides debated what guidance they want to send the jury back with, especially when it comes to those human trafficking and forced labor charges. Before that, we heard from the final witness in this case, forensic psychologist Dr. David Clayman.
Anything new that stuck out today that the doctor mentioned when looking at just the contents of the file, when looking at the contents of those photos?
Well, one thing that really stuck out to me is that we've done a lot of delving into the past, a lot of that into their Washington past. But one thing he said that stuck out to me was that right now, where the kids are living in the new homes, they're doing much better than they ever have before, that they've made significant improvements. And that's something that really stuck out to me because we have heard so much about the past. It was interesting to hear about how they're doing now.
Each side has been given an hour for closings, and defense attorneys disputing the state's claims that the 4 children were targeted, abused, and forced to do labor because they were Black. They told the jury the facts of the case don't match up to the law. They adamantly denied the couple was racist, but said they were dealing with children who had mental illness as best they could with the lack of help from the state.
All of this bad conduct that we've been hearing for 2 weeks has to be because of the race. Because of poor parenting or mental illness issues or handling mental issues poorly. It has to be because of the race. Now again, not saying we're not down to counts 13 and 19 yet, but that's what you have to believe beyond a reasonable doubt.
I want to remind you, defendant Whitefeather and defendant Lantz made a bet when they chose to move to Sissonville, West Virginia. They bet that people of West Virginia would not care if they mistreated their Black children right out in front of the world. I ask you to prove them wrong.
Again, 8 hours of deliberation. However, what we do know about this is the jury did find Lantz not guilty of 4 civil rights violations that they deemed Whitefeather was guilty of. So that's another addition to this breaking news that we're getting in. Now, in all, Lantz was found guilty of 12 of the 16 charges that he was facing. And right now, we are awaiting a press conference from Kanawha County Prosecuting Attorney Deborah Rusnick.
As you guys can see, we've got cameras inside that room. We're actually going to take a listen right now to what they have to say.
I cannot commend enough the work that my attorneys and the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office have done.
One thing that I've pointed out throughout this trial is that this is the first time in state history that human trafficking has been tried and convicted in West Virginia at the circuit court level. So this verdict, historic in a lot of ways, and that's one of the things that they mentioned at the press conference this evening. As you can imagine, these investigators, these prosecutors, the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office was there with them as well. They've been working on this for such a long time. And so to see this all come through and to get mostly guilty counts, there was just a lot of emotion, a lot of relief there. And of course, talk about how this could set precedent really across the state.
The first time since the verdict, we're hearing from the people who set this historic case into motion. That's right, the neighbors in Sissonville who saw something that didn't look right, and they did something about it.
Yeah, it was their calls for concern that ultimately led to the arrests and eventual convictions. Anna Saunders joins us live in the studio with that story tonight. Anna.
Well, Peyton, Gina, it's become a universal tagline for reporting crime. See something, say something. And that's exactly what the neighbors and a home health worker in Sissonville did multiple times in the span of 6 months. If it hadn't been for them sounding the alarms, it would be hard to say where this case and where these kids would be today.
911, where is your emergency?
I'm not sure about who I talked to about there. It's more about the wellness check on children.
That's your communication.
If there is a family that we have been calling CPS on multiple times, he has 2 kids locked in an outbuilding.
When Donald Lantz, Jeannie Whitefeather, and their 5 adopted kids moved to Sissonville in May of 2023 from Washington, they bought a house sight unseen on Cheyenne Lane. The neighbors will tell you the red flags were immediate.
I think it started because the children really wouldn't talk to us. They would look at the parents first before they'd ever say anything. And then some of the different things that they said kind of red flagged us, oh, we thought we'd be more secluded out here.
But it was what they started to see that concerned them the most. The kids doing constant manual labor in the yard, using a porta potty outside. And if the kids weren't working, they were standing still in a line. Miller said they often were in the same clothes and that she never saw them go into the house, always outside in all weather. And the people of Cheyenne Lane all began to take notice.
So they'd be like, hey, I've not seen these kids change. Have you seen these kids change? Nope, they're wearing the same thing from yesterday that they were, or they're from 5 days ago that they had on. So it was evolving, you don't want to be suspicious of people, but you are when you start noticing those different details every day are the same thing.
By late May, Miller had placed the first call to the CPS hotline and then called for a welfare check. She said on one night in particular, when they left for the entire day, they came back and the kids were in the same spot, which prompted the call.
And you actually think they may be sleeping in the barn.
Her husband even confronted Lantz about it. He testified during trial that he told Lantz he was watching him, to which Lantz responded he was watching him too. We know from trial that CPS did make a visit in late May to the house, a visit where a heads up was given to the family that they were coming, and where the kids testified that they did not tell the truth to the CPS worker because they were afraid. From then on, the calls for concern continued, and the neighbors began noticing that the kids weren't outside in their usual spot as much.
People saying, well, we need evidence. We need you to video this, or we need to, just knowing that it's happening but not getting any help. I know police need evidence, and I know, but it just feels like you could be able to do more when you know it's going on.
And then came the growing suspicions that the kids were being locked in a shed. Candace Hilbert, who is not a neighbor but worked with a family in the area for 3 days a week, was also in tune with what was going on.
It just broke my heart, and I just turned so angry. I couldn't believe that I was witnessing that, to be honest, with children.
But they also started noticing and hearing that the family was planning to move to a more secluded house in Beckley. Concerned that they would lose their chance, Hilbert says the opportunity that they were all waiting for finally came on October 2nd, where she watched Lantz lock the shed and drive off.
I seen him open the barn door up, and either he whispered to them or he was just making sure that they were still in there at that time. And then he locked it back. And I was standing there watching him the whole time. And he stood there and stared at me for probably 5-7 minutes. Like, what are you going to do about it?
So when he left in the van, what she did do about it was call the non-emergency line.
He had two kids walked in and out building. They've been in there for days.
And that was the call that led to this. The rescue from the shed, the arrests of Whitefeather-Lantz, and an investigation and a trial that ultimately led to the historic human trafficking convictions for Whitefeather-Lantz.
Guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of human trafficking.
Miller and Hilbert and 3 other neighbors testified during trial. Miller says they knew what they knew going in, but the evidence that came out in the end, from the videos of the kids inside to what the kids endured, she said it was far worse than anything they thought.
Once the verdict came through, I think for all of us up this road, it felt like a weight was lifted off of our backs. Like, we did the right thing. The kids have a chance now, and we can move on.
They could have looked the other way and given up. They could have assumed that what they were thinking and seeing wasn't the whole story. Their message for anyone having those same thoughts: make the call anyway.
You know, we're the voices to those kids. And that's the God honest truth.
You're not going to come to West Virginia thinking that we're not going to care about kids. Sorry, we're not just rednecks or hicks or, that doesn't watch out for one another. The biggest thing about West Virginia is we all love one another. And we're going to notice when you're doing something wrong, and we're going to stick up for those people.
Now, Whitefeather-Lantz are looking at decades in prison. They will be sentenced in mid-March.
And may God have mercy on your souls, because this court will not. Please stand.
Blistering words from Judge Mary Claire Akers as Jeannie Whitefeather and Donald Lantz were sentenced to decades in prison today, answering to their historic convictions last month of human trafficking and forced labor. Now, this was a case that stemmed from the October 2023 discovery of 2 teens locked in a shed in Sissonville and revealed years of abuse and neglect of 4 of their adopted Black children. Whitefeather was sentenced to a maximum of 215 years for human trafficking, forced child labor, civil rights violations, and child abuse and neglect. Her husband, Lantz, was sentenced to 160 years max for similar charges. He was found not guilty on the civil rights violations and had fewer child abuse charges than Whitefeather. This was the first time in state history that human trafficking charges were ever brought on the state level. Prosecutors were able to prove to a jury that Whitefeather and Lantz brought 5 adopted Black children to Sissonville in May of 2023 from Washington State, made them do manual labor, and neglected and abused them with physical punishment and a lack of basic necessities. This all while receiving adoption payments from the state of Minnesota. Kanawha County prosecutors holding a press conference this afternoon after securing the max sentence they were seeking.
I am so grateful for the opportunity to work with the children in this case. They are so wonderful, so smart, so funny. They are going to do amazing things in this world, and I'm so grateful to be a part of getting some semblance of justice for them after they...
Whitefeather and Lantz have also been ordered to pay $280,000 each in restitution to the children. And when Judge Mary Claire Akers handed down the sentence, it came with scathing remarks as she blasted Whitefeather and Lantz for their treatment of the children and their inability to take responsibility. Yes, and Anna Saunders, she joins us live now. And Anna, you were in that courtroom. What was it like when she handed down that sentence?
Well, Peyton, Gina, scathing is the right word for it. And it wasn't just Judge Akers who made her feelings known. The children victims in this case were there and faced Whitefeather and Lantz. Once again, the oldest teen girl looked at Whitefeather and said, "I want you to know that you are a monster."
You brought these children to West Virginia, a place that I know is almost heaven, and you put them in hell. This court will not put you in yours. And may God have mercy on your souls, because this court will not. Please stand.
After presiding over 3 weeks of their trial, Judge Mary Claire Akers did not hold back when she had her chance to address Jeannie Whitefeather and Donald Lantz before handing down the maximum sentence possible on all of their 31 counts. But before she did that, the kids in this case, the 4 victims and even the 5th child who was considered the favorite, all gave impact statements, both spoken and by letter.
And while they don't bear physical scars, it is exactly right what said and the state said, that they will bear the psychological scars of what was done to them by you, Jeannie Whitefeather, and you, Donald Lantz, for the rest of their lives.
The children, who we did not film, all detailed the years of abuse and labor and what impact it has had on them today, both psychologically and emotionally. The oldest teen girl even asked the judge if Whitefeather and Lantz could be forced to stand with their hands on their heads throughout the hearing, similar to how Whitefeather and Lantz would have the kids stand all day when they lived in Sissonville. The judge denied that request, noting the irony that it would be considered cruel and unusual for her to ask the defendants to do that in court, even though it was done to the kids in their home. Judge Akers instead opted to keep the pictures of them up as they spoke.
They all said today that they're still afraid of what will happen to them if they upset someone.
The kids all talked about how their lives are better now, but they will never be the same. At one point, the teen girl looked at Whitefeather and said, "You are the actual definition of a monster," and said that they were not just physically abused, but full out tortured. When given the chance to address the court, typically a time for apologies, Lantz only said that he loved the children. Whitefeather said that she made mistakes, but never did anything to intentionally hurt them.
And instead of apologizing today, because you never have said you're sorry, even though, Miss Whitefeather, you say you made some mistakes, but you're not sorry for them. And Mr. Hartz, I didn't hear you apologize either when you had the opportunity. But what you did do was put on one of the most reprehensible, narcissistic defenses that I have ever seen in my years of trial work.
Defense attorney Mark Lantz, who represents Whitefeather, said throughout the trial and even now she still denies any criminal responsibility.
My client's side of the story hasn't changed. It really has been that they did the best they could under the circumstances and they didn't intentionally harm anybody. So I'm not surprised that they spoke their hearts, even though a lot of people disagree with it. That's their story and that's what they've told.
The children also thanked everyone who got them out of their situation, the neighbors, the deputies, the prosecutors, and now the judge. Judge Akers, in her remarks, also commending the Sissonville neighbors who repeatedly reported Whitefeather and Lantz in Sissonville for months before their arrests. She called that the one good thing in this case.
But the good in this is the people that took action here in the state of West Virginia. The good in this is that now these children are West Virginia's children and not your children.
Now, both Whitefeather and Lantz brought forward motions for new trials today. Those were denied. Whitefeather's attorney Mark Lantz did indicate today that they will be appealing their convictions.